A woman didn't show up for work and police got involved. Right from the start, detectives hit a wall. There were plenty of clues, but none that actually led anywhere. And the case dragged on for years. But when the truth finally came out, it was so unexpected that everyone was left in absolute shock. Leslie Jennings was born on October 5, 1952, in Rhode Island. She was one of 8 children, and the family moved often because her father served in the army. When she was 12, they moved to Pensacola in Florida, where Leslie finished school. After that, she enrolled at the University of Florida to study journalism, and there she met a young man named Carl. In 1974, when Leslie was 22, they got married, and 3 years later, they had a daughter, Lauren. Sometime later, the family moved to a town called Chevy Chase, a suburb of Washington, D.C., and Leslie took a job at an advertising agency. In the years that followed, she lived a calm, steady life. On May 2, 2001, when Leslie was 48, she was supposed to be at work by 10 a.m. But she never showed up. About half an hour later, her boss started to worry. Leslie had never missed work without calling in. He pulled her daughter's number from the emergency contacts and gave her a call. But at the time, she was at university and no longer living at home, so she had no idea where her mom could be. Next, her boss got in touch with Leslie's husband, but he didn't know anything either. He said he had left the house around 7:30 that morning, and at the time, Leslie was still getting ready for work. Usually, she left shortly after him, walked to the bus stop, and took the bus into Washington. The commute took about an hour, so by then, she should have been at the office. Her husband tried calling their home phone, but no one picked up. He started to seriously worry something might have happened to her, so he decided to head back to the house. Leslie's boss did the same, afraid she might be in danger. They both arrived around 11:30 and went inside. Right away, they noticed the front door was unlocked, but the house was quiet. Then, they saw red stains along the hallway walls that looked like blood, with several bloody footprints on the floor. Leslie's boss immediately called the police while her husband searched through the house. He found their dog shut inside the basement, but Leslie herself was nowhere to be seen. The 911 operator told them to step outside and wait for officers so they wouldn't disturb any potential evidence. And the men left the house together with the dog. Police arrived within minutes and began searching the house. When they went upstairs, they found Leslie's body in the bathroom, lying face down inside the shower stall. From the way she was positioned, detectives believed she had been killed elsewhere in the house, and the killer had dragged her into the shower afterward. It looked like he may have planned to rinse her off and wash away any traces of DNA. Crime scene texts also found evidence that the killer had tried to clean up blood from the floor and hallway door. More blood was discovered in the kitchen sink, the downstairs bathroom, and even on the trash can. All of this showed that the killer had stayed inside the house for some time after the murder, making an effort to cover his tracks. But with so much blood everywhere, it was a hopeless task. One detail stood out in particular. The killer had used cleaning products, but none of those chemicals were found in the house. That suggested he had brought them with him, planning the cleanup in advance. But even with all that evidence, the local police department decided they didn't have enough to officially classify the case as a homicide. Instead, they chose to wait for the coroner's report, leaving open the possibility that Leslie's death might have been some kind of accident. One theory was that she could have slipped while cleaning the bathroom, though that explanation didn't really line up with the facts. Because of this, the house wasn't processed the way a murder scene should have been. For example, investigators never swabbed the blood on the doorframe. They just left it there. Meanwhile, the word of Leslie's death spread quickly through the community, and people were stunned. This was a town known for having one of the lowest crime rates in the entire country, where murders almost never happened. What made things even worse was the silence from the police. Nobody understood what had really happened inside that house, and the uncertainty fueled even more fear. 2 days later, the medical examiner finished the autopsy, and the results left no doubt. This was a murder. Leslie had 7 wounds on her head, caused by being slammed against a sharp, solid surface. Later, investigators determined that those injuries matched the sharp corners of the baseboard in the hallway. It looked like the attacker had knocked her down and repeatedly bashed her head against the floor. On top of that, her body showed multiple abrasions consistent with a violent struggle, and there were also clear signs of strangulation. This confirmed the detective's original theory. Leslie had been attacked and killed in the hallway, and afterward, the killer dragged her body upstairs to the bathroom, hoping to wash away the evidence. Forensics collected every possible blood sample from the house and sent them off to the lab. Meanwhile, now that detectives finally had proof they were dealing with a homicide, the real investigation began. While they waited on the DNA results, detectives started talking to Leslie's family and friends. Nobody could think of a single person who would want to hurt her. She didn't have enemies, and she never got into conflicts. Naturally, investigators first looked at Leslie's husband, Carl. He told them he'd left for work around 7:30 that morning, and a neighbor backed him up, saying they saw him leaving the house and even waving to someone at the window. His coworkers also confirmed that he showed up on time and stayed there until he got the call from Leslie's boss. That made it unlikely he could have committed the murder, unless he had somehow done it before heading to work. But there were no scratches or bruises on him, something almost impossible to avoid, given the defensive injuries Leslie had. On top of that, everyone who knew the couple swore their marriage was solid and happy. A short time later, the lab results came back. Forensics had identified foreign DNA mixed with Leslie's blood in 3 different spots throughout the house. They also found bits of skin under her fingernails, pointing to the same unknown individual. The problem was the DNA didn't match anyone in the database. Testing against Carl's DNA also came back negative. Detectives went on to collect samples from several other men who knew Leslie, but none of those were a match either. There were no other solid leads at the crime scene, and detectives quickly hit a wall. They tried piecing together a timeline and realized the killer had just a little over 2 hours to break into the house, carry out the murder, attempt to clean up, and then get away. Since the blood hadn't been fully washed off, investigators even considered the possibility that the killer might still have been inside when Carl and Leslie's boss showed up. Maybe he spotted them through a window and slipped out the back door before they came in. With no real evidence or motive to go on, police started looking into whether Leslie's case could be tied to a string of burglaries in the area. But that theory went nowhere. A short time later, the county pulled together a special task force to review unsolved murders across nearby towns. There were 6 in total, and investigators thought they might be connected. In the end, though, that link was ruled out. For months after, the case went nowhere. Detectives kept running down different suspects, but every lead fizzled out. One of the biggest problems was motive. The killer hadn't stolen anything valuable from the house, and there was no sign of personal grudges. Leslie simply didn't have enemies. To detectives, it all looked like a completely random killing, a crime with no real sense behind it. From that point on, the case went cold for years, and detectives made no progress toward an arrest. Some people still believed the killer had to be Carl, that somehow he'd managed to outsmart investigators and walk away free. But Leslie's daughter never once believed her father was guilty. She stood by him through it all. That continued until 2017, when Carl passed away of natural causes. Later, his daughter said he died of a broken heart, never knowing who had taken his wife from him. In 2022, 21 years after Leslie's murder, the local police department put together a special cold case team. They reopened her case, but the killer's DNA still wasn't showing up in the FBI's genetic database. So detectives went back over everything. They re-interviewed everyone connected to the investigation and once again reached out to the public, hoping that after all these years, someone might finally come forward with new information. But once again, nothing. That's when investigators decided to try a new approach. They sent the existing DNA samples to a company called Othram, which specialized in genetic genealogy. The way it works is pretty simple and complicated at the same time. Investigators take an unknown DNA sample and run it through public genealogy databases where people upload their own results. Almost every time, at least one relative pops up, even if it's a distant one. From there, experts build out family trees and trace them back to the most likely suspect, narrowing it down by things like age, location, and other details. The experts at Othram got to work, and before long, they managed to identify a relative of the killer, a man living in Romania. The connection turned out to be pretty distant, so it took another 2 years of digging through family trees before they finally got close to a real suspect. By 2024, they had zeroed in on a family that had been living in Leslie's town at the time of the murder. Their last name was Gliger, and the moment detectives heard it, they realized it wasn't unfamiliar. Looking back through the old case files, they found a tip that had come in nearly a year after the murder, pointing directly at a man named Eugene Gliger, a former neighbor. But that wasn't all. Detectives also discovered that Eugene had once dated the victim's daughter, Lauren. The two had been together for about 5 years. They first met in high school when they were both 15. Eugene lived just a 10-minute walk from Lauren's house, and he spent a lot of time there. Leslie thought he was a great guy, but Lauren's father never trusted him. He always said there was something off about Eugene, though he could never quite explain what it was. When they turned 20 and Lauren left for college, the relationship started to fizzle out and eventually they broke up. It was a clean break. Eugene didn't seem bitter or angry, and from that point on, Lauren barely stayed in touch with them. Over the years, though, Eugene racked up a string of arrests for illegal weapons possession, theft, and drunk driving. What made it strange was that he came from a well-off family and didn't need to steal cheap things from other people's homes. Still, none of those charges were serious enough to require him to submit a DNA sample, which explained why his profile was never in the FBI database. There was also another troubling incident that dated back to when Eugene and Lauren were 16. A woman had been attacked by a teenager, and she gave police a description that closely matched Eugene. He denied it, and none of his friends could imagine him doing something like that. In fact, Lauren and one of her friends even went down to the police station themselves to vouch for him, insisting he was completely harmless. At the time of Leslie's murder, Eugene was just 21. Detectives also uncovered another interesting detail. Only 2 months after the killing, he and his mother moved to Washington, D.C. From then on, he stayed off the radar, never getting into trouble again. What stood out was that even though a neighbor had tipped police off about him back in 2002, detectives never actually spoke to him about Leslie's case. But now, with his name flagged by the genealogical search, Eugene instantly became their prime suspect. By 2024, he was still living in D.C. and working for a company that sold surveillance equipment. Investigators started thinking about how to get a sample of his DNA, and that's when they learned he was due to return from Europe on June 9, 2024. They came up with a plan and reached out to airport staff for help. The plan was simple. A border officer pulled Eugene aside for what looked like a routine check. On the table nearby, they'd set out a few bottles of water, and Eugene casually grabbed one. A little later, he tossed the empty bottle into the trash, and detectives moved in right away. They collected it and sent it straight to the lab. Forensic experts swabbed the bottle for DNA and compared it to the genetic material found under Leslie's fingernails. It was a perfect match. That meant one thing. Leslie had scratched Eugene during the attack, leaving his DNA behind at the scene of her murder. With that undeniable evidence, detectives finally had their killer. A few days later, police approached Eugene outside his apartment and placed him under arrest. They brought Eugene in for questioning, and at first the detectives kept things basic, asking when he'd last spoken to his ex-girlfriend or her mother, and whether he'd ever set foot in their house after the breakup. Eugene acted confused, like he didn't even know what they were talking about, and eventually he asked for a lawyer. That's when the detective laid it all out. Eugene's DNA had been found inside the victim's home. Eugene looked stunned. He stammered that he'd never given a DNA sample in his life. Then, his voice shaking, he claimed he couldn't remember anything at all and didn't know what to say. The detectives reminded him that if he wanted to continue with a lawyer, they'd have to wait. Eugene muttered that he didn't know what to do and asked if he could call his girlfriend for help. He was clearly rattled. His hands were trembling, his voice breaking, and then he started to cry. "So you're saying I'm guilty before I've even been put into a court of law?" But the detective noticed something odd. Not a single tear actually rolled down his face. "There's no tears coming out of your face." She called Eugene out on it right there. Eugene quickly fired back that he was just dehydrated and his eyes were too dry for tears. Moments later, Eugene spiraled into a full-blown meltdown. "My eyes are bloodshot red because I'm just tired and drained. I don't know what's going on." Accusing the detectives of trying to frame him and insisting yet again that he couldn't remember a thing after the interrogation detectives felt even more certain Eugene was guilty. His fake crying and scattered excuses only made things worse, and with so much of his DNA found at the crime scene they didn't need a confession, so he was officially charged with first-degree murder. News of his arrest shocked many of his friends and relatives. To them, Eugene had always seemed harmless, upbeat, even generous. A guy who donated to charity and was deeply involved in his community. But not everyone was surprised. One of his ex-girlfriends shared that Eugene would often fly into rages during arguments, hurl objects at her, and punch holes in the walls. His own brother admitted he was genuinely afraid of him, believing Eugene was capable of turning violent. As for Lauren, she was in complete shock. The idea that her ex-boyfriend had murdered her mother was almost impossible to process. She recalled that shortly after the killing, she ran into Eugene and told him what had happened. He hugged her and quietly said, "I'm so sorry." The trial preparation dragged on for almost a year, and by May 2025, prosecutors decided to offer Eugene a deal. Under the terms, he would plead guilty and, in exchange, face second-degree murder instead of first-degree. That charge implied the killing wasn't premeditated and the maximum sentence was 30 years in prison. Eugene agreed to the deal and admitted guilt. But here's the catch. The plea didn't require him to explain the details of what happened, including his motive. To this day, no one knows why he killed Leslie. Detectives spent countless hours pressing him for answers, but he still refused to talk. Investigators have their theories. The leading one is that it started as a burglary gone wrong. Eugene had been linked to several thefts in the past, so detectives believed that this might have been his original plan. He knew the Jennings home inside and out, making it an easy target. Maybe he assumed no one would be home, but instead came face to face with Leslie. She knew him well, so there was no way he could just walk away unrecognized, and panic could have pushed him to kill her. Still, the theory has holes. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house, which raises the question of how Eugene even got inside. One possibility is that he simply knocked, and since Leslie had known him for years, she opened the door without hesitation. From there, he could have attacked her in the hallway. But if robbery wasn't the motive, then why did he do it? And if murder was the plan all along, why didn't he bring a weapon with him? In the end, Eugene's real motive may stay a mystery forever, unless one day he finally decides to tell the whole truth. In late August 2025, he was sentenced to 22 years in prison, but he still never explained why he had killed her. It's also worth noting that once Eugene was caught, the police department came under heavy criticism. The original team of investigators had a tip with his name just a year after the murder. Yet, for reasons no one can explain, they never even spoke to him. If they had taken his DNA sample back in 2002, this case might have been solved decades earlier. But of course, the past can't be undone. It's also worth noting that this case went down in history as the very first in Maryland to be solved through genetic genealogy, a method that has since helped crack hundreds of cases all across the country. A young woman walked out of her house and vanished without a trace. A few days later, police got involved, and right away, they uncovered several disturbing clues and a list of potential suspects. Despite that, they weren't able to solve this mystery. This went on until they stumbled upon one unusual piece of evidence, something that completely changed the course of the investigation and finally revealed what really happened to her. Misty Morse was born on April 10, 1978 in Springfield, Ohio. At some point, her family moved to a city called Indian Harbor Beach in Florida. Not long after the move, her parents decided to get a divorce, and Misty stayed with her mom but remained very close with her dad. She was a cheerful, outgoing girl who had lots of friends and loved outdoors. More than anything, she enjoyed swimming in the ocean, surfing, and just hanging out at the beach with her friends. After high school, Misty worked a few different jobs before enrolling in a local community college. She wasn't sure what career she wanted to pursue, so she planned to figure it out along the way. By the summer of 2000, 22-year-old Misty was working as a waitress at a local cafe and spending most of her free time with friends. On the evening of July 20th, Misty told her mom she was heading out. They talked for a few minutes, but then Misty's phone rang. She answered with just a few words, hung up, and told her mom she had to go. The next day, when her mother got home from work, Misty wasn't there. At first, she didn't think much of it. Misty sometimes worked late shifts, and on those days they barely saw each other. Plus, she was an adult, so her mom thought that maybe she had just stayed over at a friend's place. But when another day passed and Misty still hadn't come home or reached out, her mom started to worry. It had been 2 days now, and there was not a single word from her. What made it even stranger was that they shared a car, switching off every week. But this time, Misty never came to pick it up. Her mom tried calling her multiple times, but Misty never answered. This went on until July 24th, when her worry turned into full-blown panic, and she decided it was time to go to the police. But before she could, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she saw police officers standing there, and the moment she looked at their faces, she knew something was terribly wrong. They told her they'd found Misty's body. On July 23rd, the day before police arrived at Misty's mother's door, a retired judge in Merritt Island stepped outside to mow his lawn. His property sat right along the river, and as soon as he looked toward the water, he noticed something weird. At first, he thought it was the body of a large animal in the river. Then, a strong, unmistakable smell of decay hit him. As he moved closer, he realized it wasn't an animal. It was a human body. The judge immediately notified the police. When officers arrived, they confirmed that it was a woman's body floating in the water. But they ran into a serious problem right away. The body was already in an advanced state of decomposition, making it extremely difficult to recover. To retrieve it without further damage, they had to use a special type of fabric, one that allowed water to drain through while keeping the remains securely contained. When detectives finally managed to retrieve the body, it became immediately clear they were dealing with a murder. The victim had no clothes on, and her wrists and ankles were bound with rope. Police also found large amounts of duct tape on her body. Her legs had been tied to plastic shopping bags, which investigators suspected had been filled with rocks or some other heavy objects meant to keep her submerged. But the bags apparently had torn open, and whatever was inside had spilled out. In addition to the rope and tape, detectives noticed something unusual. A few rubber cords, the kind specifically used to secure window protective screens, had also been tied around her body. All of these items were sent to the lab for analysis while medical examiners began their work. But right away, they faced a major obstacle. Determining the exact cause of death was nearly impossible. There were no stab wounds or gunshot injuries, and the level of decomposition made it difficult to identify less obvious trauma. In the end, experts concluded that the most likely cause of death was either strangulation or drowning. The second theory suggested that she had been in the water for several days, and there was a strong possibility that she was still alive when she was thrown in. There were no obvious clues on the body, no DNA, fingerprints, or anything that could point to a suspect. So, investigators focused on identifying the victim. It wasn't easy, but the next day they finally got a match. Fingerprints confirmed that the woman found in the river was Misty Morse. By that time, forensic experts had already examined the ropes, plastic bags, and duct tape used to restrain her. But unfortunately, none of those items yielded any useful evidence. There was, however, one thing that stood out. A few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape. It was pretty obvious that they didn't belong to Misty, and detectives knew these hairs could be a crucial lead, so they sent them to the lab for further analysis. Once investigators confirmed Misty's identity, they went to speak with her mother. She told them the last time she saw her daughter was on the evening of July 20th, 3 days before Misty's body was found. She also mentioned something that caught their attention. Right before leaving the house, Misty got a short phone call. It seemed like someone had arrived to pick her up and was calling to let her know they were outside. But Misty never said who she was meeting, which made it much harder to track down a potential suspect. Hoping to find answers, detectives requested her phone records. But there was a major problem. At the time, Phone companies didn't have the capability to provide details about incoming calls, not even the caller's number. The only thing police could confirm was that Misty received 2 calls that night. The first one lasted a few minutes. Then, shortly after, there was a second, much shorter call, the one her mother heard right before Misty walked out the door. Detectives searched Misty's room. They found her purse with all of her belongings except for 2 things: her driver's license and her phone. The fact that she left her purse behind suggested that she likely hadn't planned to be gone for long, but somewhere along the way something went terribly wrong. This led investigators to a troubling conclusion: Misty's killer was probably someone she knew well, someone she trusted enough to leave with that night. Forensic experts also had some interesting findings. While they hadn't recovered any clear evidence from the ropes or duct tape, they did notice something unusual. The type of rope used to bind Misty was commonly found on boats. Moreover, the knots were tied in a way that suggested the killer had some kind of military or maritime training. These were knots typically taught in the Navy and the Coast Guard. And then there was the duct tape. It wasn't just any kind of tape. It was actually a special type, designed specifically for temporary repairs on boats. All of this pointed in a specific direction. Misty's killer not only had access to a boat, but likely had some kind of military background. With no other solid leads, detectives turned their focus to Misty's personal life, hoping to uncover any connections that might bring them closer to finding her killer. Misty's mother told detectives that in the weeks leading up to her death, she had been seeing a guy named Teddy. He was a relative of one of her coworkers, and while they had gone on a few dates, their relationship hadn't had time to develop into anything serious. But when police looked into Teddy's background, they found something alarming. He had a long criminal record. He was arrested for assaults, sexual offenses, theft, and some other crimes. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and Teddy confirmed that he and Misty had been casually seeing each other for a few weeks, but insisted he had no reason to hurt her. As the interrogation went on, detectives started to second-guess whether he was involved. Teddy genuinely seemed upset about Misty's death, and nothing in his behavior indicated that he was trying to hide something. Still, they weren't taking any chances and asked for a DNA sample. At that point, they didn't actually have any DNA from the killer, so this was more of a test to see if Teddy was willing to cooperate, and he agreed to provide his DNA sample right away. He also gave them permission to search his apartment without a warrant. Detectives looked everywhere but found nothing that tied him to the crime. On top of that, investigators learned that Teddy had never served in the military and didn't have access to a boat. In the end, they started doubting his involvement and turned their attention to other potential suspects. Misty's relatives told investigators about another guy she had gone on a date with, someone named Bobby. At first, he didn't seem like a likely suspect. But then, detectives learned something that caught their attention. After their date, Misty told friends that Bobby wasn't really her type and that she wasn't interested in seeing him again. But Bobby didn't seem to get the message. He kept calling, trying to convince her to meet up again. He was persistent. Too persistent, actually. In fact, Misty even told people that she felt like he was stalking her. Detectives decided to pay Bobby a visit, and as soon as they arrived at his house, they noticed something that made their suspicions grow. He had a boat on his property. Bobby agreed to answer their questions. He claimed that he wasn't too bothered that Misty stopped responding to him, but he did admit that he had been calling her every day, right up until July 23rd. That's when he found out she was dead. For the most part, Bobby acted like he was genuinely upset about Misty's death. But then, something completely unexpected happened. In the middle of the conversation, suddenly reached into his pocket and pulled out Misty's driver's license, then handed it over to the detectives. He explained that he had been holding onto it since their first date. According to him, Misty didn't have any pockets that night, so she asked him to keep her ID for her, and then she simply forgot to take it back. Detectives found this story highly suspicious. Their date had been weeks ago. Was it really possible that Misty never noticed her ID was missing? And if she had left it with him, why wouldn't she have asked for it back? With growing doubts, investigators asked for permission to search Bobby's home. He agreed, but after a thorough search, they came up empty-handed. There was nothing linking him to the murder. And then there was another issue. Bobby had never served in the military, which didn't match the profile of the killer. So, it seemed like Bobby was just another dead end. In the end, detectives left Bobby's house empty-handed, but just as they were about to leave, he surprised them yet again. He suddenly remembered something from his date with Misty, something that might actually be useful. According to Bobby, Misty had mentioned an ex-boyfriend who had a reputation for being quite aggressive. Bobby didn't know his name, but he did recall one key detail. The guy had served in the Marines. That immediately caught the detectives' attention, so they went straight to Misty's mother to ask if she knew who Bobby might have been talking about. She immediately had an answer. His name was Brent Huck. Her mother explained that Misty and Brent had been together for quite a while, but had broken up about a year before her death. She remembered that Misty had described Brent as controlling and aggressive. He always wanted to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. Eventually, his behavior became too much and Misty ended the relationship. After that, her mother never heard anything about him again. Detectives started digging into Brent Huck, and what they found was quite interesting. He lived in the same area where Misty's body had been found. He had also served in the Marines, just like their profile suggested. And on top of that, he worked as a charter boat captain, meaning he had easy access to boats and the type of specialized equipment found on Misty's body. With all of this in mind, detectives decided to bring Brent in for questioning. But they didn't want to tip him off. Instead of confronting him directly, they told him they were just trying to gather as much information as possible about Misty's personal life, since they had no strong leads. Brent agreed to talk. He admitted that he and Misty continued seeing each other from time to time after their breakup, but insisted that their relationship was completely over. There was nothing romantic between them anymore. But as the conversation went on, something felt off. Brent didn't seem even remotely upset about Misty's death. If anything, he was the opposite. He came across as cocky, almost arrogant. It was a stark contrast to how other suspects reacted when talking about Misty's murder. And that alone was enough to make detectives suspicious. Despite Brent's arrogant demeanor, detectives managed to get some very interesting information out of him. When asked about the last time he spoke to Misty, Brent named the exact night she disappeared. Wednesday, July 20th. That was the same night Misty told her mom she was heading out to meet someone. Brent admitted that he called her twice that evening, but he insisted that they never saw each other that night. That immediately raised red flags for detectives. Based on what Misty's mother had told them, they were convinced that whoever made the last call was the person who picked her up. And Misty's phone records showed that she hadn't received any other calls that evening. But Brent stuck to his story. He claimed that he had called Misty because he had heard some rumors that she was telling people she was pregnant with his child. At the time, he was dating someone else. And according to him, these rumors were threatening his relationship. So he called Misty to convince her to stop spreading lies. Detectives, however, weren't buying it. For one, medical examiners found no signs of pregnancy during Misty's autopsy. And on top of that, none of her friends had ever heard her say anything about being pregnant. So Brent's entire story just didn't add up. Detectives asked Brent for permission to search his home. And just like the previous suspects, he agreed. But this time, they found more than they expected. The first thing that caught their attention was in the kitchen. Brent had multiple plastic bags from the same store as the ones that had been tied to Misty's legs. At first, this didn't seem like much. After all, plenty of people shop at the same grocery store. But detectives decided to take a closer look. Forensic experts examined the manufacturing codes stamped onto each bag during production. And when they compared them with the ones found with Misty's body, they discovered something disturbing. They were all made at the same time on the same production line in the same factory. This meant that there was a strong chance that the bags used in the crime had come directly from Brent's kitchen. And that was just the beginning. In his garage, detectives found the exact same type of rubber cord that had been wrapped around Misty's body. Just like with the bags, they checked the serial number and confirmed that both the cord in Brent's garage and the one found on Misty's body had been produced on the same machine from the same batch. Then, they found a roll of special marine duct tape, the same kind that had been used to bind Misty. And finally, they discovered rope identical to what was found on Misty's body, tied with the exact same military-style knots. At this point, detectives didn't just have a suspicion, they had evidence. After wrapping up the search and analyzing all those items, detectives were almost certain that Brent was responsible for Misty's murder. They believed that he might have actually heard rumors about Misty being pregnant with his child and panicked. Maybe he feared this would ruin his current relationship and decided to eliminate the problem before it could escalate. What he didn't realize, however, was that Misty wasn't pregnant, and she likely had no idea that these rumors even existed. With all the evidence in hand, detectives took their case to the district attorney, hoping to move forward with formal charges. But then, things took a frustrating turn. After reviewing the case, the prosecutor refused to press charges. He explained that every single piece of evidence was circumstantial. There was no direct proof, no DNA, no eyewitnesses, no confession, just a strong chain of coincidences. As convincing as it seemed, the prosecutor warned them that it wouldn't be enough for conviction in court. In the end, he told detectives they needed to find something stronger. So, despite having a prime suspect and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, investigators found themselves back at square one, knowing who likely did it but unable to prove his guilt. Detectives did have one more piece of evidence, though, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to crack the case. As we know, forensic experts had found a few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape on Misty's body. When they analyzed them, they discovered that the hairs belonged to an animal, most likely a dog, and Brent just so happened to own a black dog, a mix between a German Shepherd and a Rottweiler. Detectives strongly suspected that the hairs came from his dog, but there was a problem. In those years, no forensic lab in the country was capable of conducting a full DNA analysis on dog hair. Without that technology, they couldn't prove the hairs belonged to Brent's dog, and without the proof, the evidence was useless. So, with no other leads to follow, the case stalled. For months, detectives searched for anything that could break it open, but they kept hitting dead ends, and Misty's killer was still out there. For 2 years, the case remained at a standstill until detectives took another look at the evidence and stumbled upon something new. They learned that a recent murder case in California had been solved using DNA analysis of dog hair, and this was exactly the kind of breakthrough they needed. Without wasting any time, they reached out to the same lab that had conducted the analysis in California and asked them to examine their evidence. Forensic experts extracted a DNA profile from the animal hairs found on the duct tape. Then, detectives collected a sample from Brent's dog. When the results came back, there was a perfect match. The hairs belonged to the same dog. And there was an even deeper connection. This wasn't just any dog. Misty had actually given Brent the dog as a gift back when they were dating. Now, detectives had the evidence they needed to finally bring him to justice. They went back to the prosecutor, and this time he agreed to take the case to trial. On October 23, 2002, Brent was finally arrested, and a few months later his trial began. Brent never backed down, insisting that he had nothing to do with Misty's murder. He claimed that the real killer must have been one of her other ex-boyfriends, but with a stack of evidence against him, the prosecution had no trouble convincing the jury of his guilt. In the end, Brent Huck was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. During the trial, prosecutors assumed that Brent had truly believed the pregnancy rumors and panicked, deciding to get rid of Misty before she could ruin his life. We may never know exactly how he convinced her to meet up that night or how things escalated once she did. But detectives had their own theory. They believed Brent lured Misty to his home, tied her up, and loaded her into his boat. Then he took her out on the water and threw her in, leaving her to drown. After his conviction, Brent tried to appeal, but the court denied his request. To this day, he remains behind bars, still insisting he's innocent. After the sentencing, Misty's father spoke to reporters. He said he hoped Brent would live 1,000 years in that prison cell, waking up every single day, remembering the pain he caused to their family. Family, share your thoughts on this story in the comment section and don't forget to press the like button. A Harvard student was found dead in her own apartment, but detectives couldn't find a single clue pointing to her killer. The case made headlines and even sparked some bizarre theories, but the investigation dragged on for decades. And nearly 50 years later, it wasn't the police who cracked the case. It was a group of everyday people who refused to let the truth stay buried. Jane Britton was born on May 17, 1945, in Boston, Massachusetts. Her father was a vice president of Radcliffe College in Cambridge, and her mom was a scholar in medieval history. So, it's no surprise that from a young age, Jane developed a deep interest in history, and by the time she was in high school, she'd already decided she wanted to study anthropology. She was a straight-A student, played piano, loved to paint, and spent her free time horseback riding. After graduating at the top of her class, she enrolled in her father's college and quickly became one of its standout students. Eventually, her hard work paid off. She was accepted into Harvard's anthropology graduate program, where she started working toward her PhD. In her second year, she got the chance to join an archaeological dig in Iran, working under a well-known scholar. She made a great impression and even contributed a few important discoveries. Outside of academics, Jane was well-liked among her peers, and she had recently started dating a fellow student named James. On January 7, 1969, Jane was supposed to take her final exams. She was 23 at the time and looking forward to finally finishing school and starting her career. But that morning, she never showed up. Her boyfriend James thought it was odd. He tried calling her a few times before the exam, but she didn't pick up. No one else, neither students nor professors, had any idea why she was missing. So after class, James decided to walk over to her apartment, which was about 15 minutes from campus. When he got to her floor, he knocked, but there was no answer. A fellow student and mutual friend named Donald, who lived next door, stepped out when he heard the knocking. He said he hadn't seen Jane since the night before, and her apartment had been quiet ever since. James knocked a few more times, but still got no answer. That's when he started to worry. He knew Jane's front door lock was basically broken, so he tried the handle and the door swung open. Inside the apartment, nothing seemed out of place except for one thing. It was freezing. When James walked into the kitchen, he saw the window was wide open, even though it was in the middle of winter. Then he stepped into Jane's bedroom and saw her lying face down on the bed. Her nightgown had ridden up, so he immediately stepped back out and asked Donald's wife to check if Jane was okay. James thought maybe she was just sick or asleep, but when Donald's wife came out of the room, the look on her face said it all. She couldn't even speak. James went back into the bedroom, and that's when he saw it. Jane's face was covered with a rug and a coat. When he lifted them, he realized she was dead. He immediately called the police, and it only took one look for officers to realize they were dealing with a murder. The body was handed over to the medical examiner, and detectives began processing the crime scene. One of the first things they noticed was that nothing appeared to be stolen. Jane's jewelry, cash, and other valuables were still in place, which ruled out robbery as a possible motive. There were also no signs of a struggle, which made investigators think the killer might have caught her off guard, possibly while she was sleeping. That theory was supported by the fact that none of Jane's neighbors reported hearing anything unusual. The autopsy revealed that Jane had been struck multiple times in the head with a heavy object, likely a hammer or a rod. It was also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted. After speaking with Jane's boyfriend, police learned that the night before, the two of them had gone out to dinner with some other students and then went ice skating. James said he walked her home afterward and left around 11:30 p.m. Donald and his wife told investigators that about an hour later, Jane stopped by their place for a quick glass of cherry wine, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. According to the medical examiner, she had likely been killed about 10 hours before her body was found, meaning the attack must have happened not long after she returned to her apartment. The apartment didn't give detectives much to work with. Crime scene techs found a few fingerprints that didn't belong to Jane's friends or neighbors, but they couldn't match them to anyone in their records. As for how the killer got in, police had a couple of theories. For one, Jane's front door lock hadn't worked for a while, so someone could have just walked right in. But there was also another way. Jane's window locks were just as unreliable as her door, and even though she lived on the 4th floor, there was a fire escape right outside her apartment. So anyone could have climbed up and slipped in through the window. That theory seemed more likely after detectives talked to everyone in the building and found a kid who remembered hearing noises on the fire escape that night. But there was one problem. He said it happened around 9 p.m., but Jane didn't get home with her boyfriend until almost 11:30. Another witness came forward and said he saw a man running away from the building around 1:30 in the morning. He didn't get a good look at the guy, just remembered that he was about 6 feet tall and had an average build. That account seemed a little more promising, since the timing lined up with the estimated time of the murder. But without more detail, there wasn't much police could do with it. Still, based on both witnesses' statements, detectives began to think the killer might have climbed the fire escape around 9 p.m., then waited there for hours until Jane came home. Donald also told police something interesting. Earlier that evening, before Jane got home, he had gone into her apartment to use her fridge, where he and his wife kept some of the groceries. He said everything looked normal at the time, which meant the killer either hadn't come in yet or had been waiting outside on the fire escape. It was also possible that the first witness simply got the timing wrong. Still, detectives couldn't rule out another possibility. Maybe none of this had anything to do with the murder at all. They found out that residents in the building often left their windows open, even in winter, because the heating was way too strong. By the next morning, news of Jane's murder had spread all over the university, and it didn't take long before the story made headlines across the country. Police were under intense pressure. Students at one of the nation's top universities were scared to be on campus while the killer was still out there. And pretty quickly, a new theory began to take shape. What if the person responsible was a fellow Harvard student? There was a pretty unusual reason behind that theory. Investigators had found a reddish powder on Jane's body and in her room, something that looked like ochre or iron oxide. One of the professors explained that in some ancient cultures, especially in places like Iran, where Jane had recently been, it was tradition to sprinkle this kind of powder over the dead. That led to speculation that the killer might have been another anthropology student, someone who not only had that kind of knowledge, but possibly even traveled to Iran with Jane. Supporting that theory was the fact that nothing in her apartment had been stolen, not even cash, suggesting the motive might have been personal. Police weren't totally sold on the idea, but they couldn't ignore it either. Detectives made a list of around 100 students and faculty with anthropological backgrounds and checked out every single one. But it got them nowhere. Sometime later, a new theory surfaced. What if Jane had been killed by a serial offender? 5 years earlier, another female student had been murdered in the very same building, just 2 floors below Jane's apartment. At that time, detectives suspected the infamous Boston Strangler might have been behind it, and he even confessed to the crime. But a lot of people had doubts. Many believed he might have falsely confessed, which isn't uncommon in high-profile cases. And besides, by the time Jane was murdered, the Boston Strangler was already confined to a secure psychiatric facility. So either way, he couldn't have been involved. While detectives still had no solid leads, local newspapers were busy spreading theories and pointing fingers at the university itself. Harvard had purchased the building a few years earlier and started housing students there, but the place was in pretty bad shape. Most of the apartment locks didn't work or would get stuck, and the windows were just as bad. Residents said they could be pulled open from the outside without much effort. Because of that, newspapers began criticizing the university for letting students live in such unsafe conditions. Meanwhile, police kept looking for anything that might help. They gave polygraph tests to Jane's boyfriend and her neighbors, questioned several other suspects, and even placed cameras at her funeral to record everyone who showed up. Detectives identified every person in attendance, but none of them could be linked to the crime. Weeks passed and they were still no closer to finding the killer. That's how things stayed until February 6th. Almost exactly 1 month after Jane's murder, police discovered the body of a 50-year-old woman named Ada Ben. She was found in her apartment just about a mile from Jane's. Ada was lying face down in her bed, her nightgown pushed up, and her head covered with several blankets. Just like Jane, she'd been bludgeoned in the head with a heavy object, and it looked like she'd also been attacked in her sleep. Local media immediately jumped on the striking similarities between the two cases. But for some reason, police pushed back against this theory. They announced that they saw no connection between the murders and didn't believe they were dealing with the same killer. That statement was met with a predictable wave of skepticism. Most students and locals were convinced that a serial predator was out there and that he could strike again at any moment. But just like Jane's case, investigators found no solid leads, and the second murder investigation soon went cold too. There were no new developments in Jane's case, and eventually it was shelved. Over the years, detectives revisited the file from time to time, but each attempt led nowhere. At one point, the local police department handed the case over to the state police, who launched their own investigation. But again, they came up empty. In the late 80s, when DNA analysis was becoming a standard tool in forensics, detectives decided to revisit the physical evidence. That's when they found a set of samples collected from Jane's body. The lab managed to isolate a small trace of semen, likely from the suspect, but it wasn't enough to build a full DNA profile. Years later, once the FBI's National DNA Database came online, analysts searched for a match, but nothing came up. In 2006, they tried again using more advanced technology, hoping for a breakthrough, but once again they hit a wall. Case stayed cold for several more years until a group of amateur sleuths took an interest in it. One of them was a retired writer who'd been a young reporter at the time of Jane's murder. In fact, it was only his second day on the job when he was assigned to cover the case. Decades later, he decided to revisit it, determined to finally uncover the truth and write a book about what really happened. The second was a journalist from Harvard. When she learned about Jane's murder happening so close to her own campus, she became deeply invested and set out to help solve it. They were joined by a forum moderator who ran a site dedicated to unsolved crimes, and she too was determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. They started digging into Jane's case and submitted multiple records requests to the police, but almost all of them were denied. The few documents they did receive were mostly old newspaper clippings with nothing more than surface-level facts. At the time, that kind of secrecy was common practice in Massachusetts, even though police departments in other states were far more open with cold case files. But the group wasn't ready to give up. They took the fight to an appeals court, arguing that transparency had already helped solve other decades-old cases by getting more people involved and generating new leads. The court rejected their petition, but even that didn't stop them. Over the next several years, they kept filing lawsuits against the district attorney's office. One by one, each suit was dismissed, but all that pressure still made a difference. After years of being reminded about the case, authorities finally agreed to reopen it in 2017. Experts took another look at the biological evidence from the crime scene, and this time they managed to extract a somewhat stable DNA sample. When they ran it through the FBI database, they got a potential match. A man named Michael Sumter. The problem was, the match was only partial, which wouldn't hold up in court, and the sample wasn't strong enough to extract a full profile. Still, detectives began looking into Sumter, hoping to find something solid. He had a criminal record for 3 separate sexual assaults, which is why his DNA was in the system in the first place. Then, in 2010 and 2012, police solved 2 cold case murders from the 1970s after matching old DNA samples to Sumter's profile. All of his known crimes took place in Boston, not far from Harvard. Investigators also learned that, around the time of Jane's murder, he was dating a woman who lived near the university. On top of that, he matched the description of the man seen running from Jane's building, both in height and build. Everything pointed to Sumter as a likely suspect, but there was one big problem. He had died of cancer back in 2001, which meant they couldn't get a direct DNA sample from him. Still, detectives weren't ready to give up. Instead of trying to test Sumter himself, they decided to look for a close male relative and eventually found out he had a brother who was still alive. It took some time to track him down, but once they did, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The results came back as a match, though not quite perfect. Once again, the issue was with the degraded sample from the crime scene. It just wasn't enough to build a full genetic profile. Even so, the test was conclusive enough to rule out all but 0.08% of the global male population. That may still be nearly 350,000 people, but considering Sumter lived near the crime scene and had a history of similar assaults, it was more than enough to point to him as the killer. In 2018, 49 years after Jane's murder, Police held a press conference and finally announced that the case had been officially solved. They believe that on the night of the murder, Michael Sumter followed Jane home and waited until her boyfriend left. Then he climbed up the fire escape, came in through the kitchen window, and attacked her with the intent to assault. As for why the DNA match wasn't made until 2017, detectives had a simple explanation. Sumter's DNA had been in the system for years, but the sample from Jane's case was so degraded that earlier technology couldn't get a strong enough profile to even find a partial match. It was only with newer, more sensitive equipment that they were able to make the connection. In the 2 other murder cases linked to Sumter, full DNA profiles had been available, making those matches easier to confirm. Police were never able to link him to the murder of the second woman found a month later. The problem was, there was no usable DNA from that crime scene, so detectives couldn't say for sure. But given the eerie similarities between the 2 cases, many believe Sumter was responsible for that one too. As for the reddish powder found in Jane's room and on her body, something that sparked theories about ancient burial rituals, police believed it was most likely just pigment from the paint she used in her artwork. There was no evidence it had anything to do with the murder itself. In the end, Jane's case was finally closed, even if it took nearly 5 decades. And much of that was thanks to the small group of citizens who refused to let her story be forgotten and pushed the police to give the case another look. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button. Also subscribe to my channel if you like my content. In the quiet, picturesque town of Pine Hill, the gruesome murder of Jennifer Johnson sent shockwaves through the community. What appeared to be a peaceful, close-knit suburban enclave was shattered by a crime of passion and betrayal that revealed the dark underbelly of seemingly idyllic lives. The lives of 2 couples, Daniel and Linda Garner, and Mark and Jennifer Johnson, intertwined in ways that would lead to obsession, deceit, and ultimately murder. Daniel Garner was a respected architect, known for his charming demeanor and seemingly perfect marriage to Linda, a dedicated schoolteacher. Mark Johnson, a successful financial advisor, and his wife Jennifer, were the Garners' closest friends. The 2 couples shared more than just neighborhood barbecues and weekend getaways. They also engaged in a consensual wife-swapping arrangement that initially brought excitement and novelty to their lives. However, beneath the surface of this unconventional lifestyle, dangerous emotions were brewing. Daniel's fascination with Jennifer grew into an all-consuming obsession, one that Linda, his wife, was painfully aware of. Jennifer, sensing the intensity of Daniel's feelings, decided to put an end to the arrangement, not realizing the deadly consequences her decision would provoke. Daniel and Linda Garner had been married for 10 years, and from the outside, their marriage appeared to be a model of stability and happiness. Daniel was a successful architect, known for his innovative designs and charismatic personality. Linda, a 3rd-grade teacher, was beloved by her students and respected by her colleagues. They lived in a charming house on Maple Street, surrounded by a well-tended garden that Linda took great pride in. Mark and Jennifer Johnson moved to Pine Hill 5 years ago and quickly became friends with the Garners. Mark, a financial advisor, was outgoing and affable, always the life of the party. Jennifer, with her striking beauty and magnetic personality, was equally popular. The Johnsons' arrival brought a new dynamic to the neighborhood, and their friendship with the Garners blossomed over shared interests and mutual respect. The idea of wife-swapping was first brought up during a dinner party at the Garners' home, fueled by wine and a sense of adventure. The conversation turned to the topic of open relationships. To everyone's surprise, the concept was met with curiosity rather than shock. Over the next few weeks, the idea was discussed more seriously, with all parties agreeing to boundaries and rules to ensure their primary relationships remained intact. The first encounter was awkward but exciting. Daniel and Jennifer and Mark and Linda exchanged partners for the night. It was a thrilling yet nerve-wracking experience, but one that left them eager for more. What started as a once-in-a-while experiment soon became a regular part of their lives, adding a spark to both marriages. Initially, the arrangement seemed to work well. Both couples appeared happier and more connected. They maintained their social activities, often hosting joint parties and going on vacations together. Their secret was carefully guarded, discussed only within the confines of their homes or during private gatherings. The novelty of the arrangement brought a sense of exhilaration, and for a while it seemed like they had found the perfect balance. However, as the months passed, subtle changes began to surface, particularly in Daniel's behavior. He started to show an unusual amount of interest in Jennifer, often finding reasons to spend time alone with her. Linda noticed his increasing preoccupation, but chose to ignore it, hoping it was just a phase. Mark, too, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. Unbeknownst to the others, Daniel's fascination with Jennifer was turning into something deeper and more troubling. He found himself thinking about her constantly, replaying their encounters in his mind and craving more time with her. What had started as a harmless adventure was slowly morphing into an obsession that would have devastating consequences for all involved. Daniel's fascination with Jennifer was no longer just a thrill. It had evolved into an all-consuming obsession. He thought about her incessantly, his mind wandering to their encounters during work meetings and family dinners. His architectural projects, once his passion, now seemed secondary to his desire for Jennifer. He started to find ways to be near her, volunteering to help with tasks Mark usually handled or inviting the Johnsons over more frequently. Linda began to notice the change in her husband. At first, she attributed it to the excitement of their new lifestyle, but soon it became clear that Daniel's interest in Jennifer went beyond their agreement. He became irritable and distant when they weren't with the Johnsons, and his conversations often veered towards Jennifer's likes and dislikes, her quirks and habits. One evening, while cleaning up after a dinner party, Linda confronted Daniel. His reaction was defensive, dismissing her concerns as jealousy. Linda, not wanting to disrupt the delicate balance they had established, let it go but kept a closer eye on him. Her suspicions grew when she found him staring at Jennifer during gatherings, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. Jennifer, too, began to sense Daniel's growing obsession. Initially flattered by his attention, she soon found it uncomfortable. His touches became more possessive, his words more intimate than appropriate. She discussed her discomfort with Mark, who brushed it off, believing Daniel was just more expressive in his affections. Mark's nonchalance left Jennifer feeling isolated in her concerns. The turning point came during a weekend trip to a lakeside cabin. The couples had planned the getaway to reconnect and enjoy some time away from their routine. However, the trip only served to highlight Daniel's fixation. He monopolized Jennifer's time, insisting on taking her out on the lake alone, leaving Mark and Linda behind. The tension was palpable, and Jennifer's attempts to distance herself were met with subtle resistance from Daniel. One night, while sitting by the fire, Daniel made a comment that crossed the line. He spoke about leaving everything behind and starting fresh. Just the two of them. Jennifer, shocked and unsettled, excused herself and went to bed early. Linda, who had overheard the conversation, confronted Daniel again. This time he was less dismissive, but still refused to acknowledge the depth of his feelings. Linda's frustration grew as she realized the extent of Daniel's obsession. She loved her husband, but was increasingly aware that his infatuation with Jennifer could destroy their marriage and their friendship with the Johnsons. Despite her efforts to intervene, Daniel's behavior only became more erratic. He started to follow Jennifer outside of their arranged meetings, showing up at her yoga classes, and even appearing at her workplace under the guise of casual visits. Jennifer's unease turned to fear. She confided in a close friend, who advised her to distance herself from Daniel as much as possible. Determined to take control, Jennifer decided to end the arrangement altogether. She hoped that by doing so, Daniel would return to his senses, and they could all move on from this chapter without causing further harm. One evening, while Mark was away on a business trip, Daniel showed up at the Johnsons' house unannounced. Jennifer was taken aback but let him in, hoping to avoid a scene. They sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken tension. Daniel confessed his feelings for her. Speaking of a future where they could be together openly, Jennifer, horrified, tried to reason with him, explaining that their arrangement was never meant to be more than a temporary excitement. As Daniel's declarations became more intense, Jennifer's fear turned to anger. She realized she needed to put an end to this before it destroyed her marriage and her friendship with Linda. She told Daniel firmly that their arrangement was over, and that he needed to respect her boundaries and her marriage. Daniel, visibly shaken, tried to persuade her to reconsider, but Jennifer stood her ground. Over the next few days, Jennifer avoided Daniel, hoping he would come to his senses. She confided in Linda, who listened with a heavy heart. Linda knew her husband's obsession had gone too far, and while she wanted to support Jennifer, she also felt a twisted loyalty to Daniel. She promised Jennifer she would talk to him, hoping to defuse the situation. However, Daniel's obsession only deepened. He started showing up at Jennifer's work, waiting for her after hours, and leaving her messages expressing his undying love. Jennifer, feeling increasingly unsafe, decided to confront him one last time, hoping to make him understand the gravity of his actions. They met at a secluded park away from prying eyes. Jennifer reiterated that their arrangement was over and that his behavior was unacceptable. She pleaded with him to let go and move on. Daniel, unable to accept her rejection, grew desperate. He accused her of leading him on and playing with his emotions. Jennifer, maintaining her composure, insisted that they part ways and return to their respective marriages. Unbeknownst to them, Linda had followed Daniel to the park. She watched from a distance, her heart pounding as she saw the confrontation unfold. She could see the anguish on Daniel's face and the determination on Jennifer's. Linda knew that this confrontation was inevitable, but she also feared what might happen next. As the argument escalated, Daniel's desperation turned to anger. Jennifer's refusal to entertain his fantasies felt like a personal betrayal. He lashed out verbally, calling her names and accusing her of ruining his life. Jennifer, holding back tears, stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. Linda, watching from the shadows, felt a surge of panic. She knew she had to intervene before things got out of hand. She stepped out of her hiding place and approached the two, her voice shaking as she called out to Daniel. The sight of Linda seemed to snap Daniel out of his rage, and he turned to her, his expression a mix of confusion and relief. Jennifer, taking advantage of the distraction, walked away, determined to put as much distance between herself and Daniel as possible. Linda, now alone with her husband, tried to calm him down. She reassured him that they would find a way to move past this, but inside she knew that their lives had been irreversibly changed. The affair had reached its breaking point, and Jennifer's decision to end the arrangement had set off a chain of events that could not be undone. As the dust settled, the true extent of Daniel's obsession and the depths of Linda's complicity would soon come to light, leading to a tragic and violent conclusion. The confrontation at the park had left Daniel in a state of turmoil. Jennifer's firm rejection and Linda's unexpected appearance had shaken him to his core. He returned home that night, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and despair. Linda, sensing the storm brewing within him, tried to soothe his troubled thoughts, but Daniel remained inconsolable. Over the next few days, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He vacillated between bouts of intense anger and deep despondency. He stopped going to work, spending his days obsessing over Jennifer's rejection and the perceived injustices he had suffered. Linda, unable to reach him, felt her own frustration and fear growing, but she wasn't prepared for the drastic turn of events that would soon unfold. Jennifer, on the other hand, was determined to move forward. She avoided all contact with Daniel, focusing on her work and her relationship with Mark. She hadn't told her husband the full extent of Daniel's obsession, fearing his reaction and the potential fallout. She hoped that by cutting ties, Daniel would eventually come to terms with the end of their arrangement and leave her alone. One evening, Jennifer returned home from work to find Daniel waiting for her outside her house. Her heart sank at the sight of him, and she steeled herself for another confrontation. She approached him cautiously, her voice steady but firm, as she told him to leave. Daniel, his eyes wild with desperation, begged her for one last chance to explain himself. Jennifer, sensing the futility of the conversation, tried to walk past him, but Daniel grabbed her arm. His grip was tight and painful, and Jennifer could see the madness in his eyes. She struggled to break free, her voice rising as she demanded he let go. The noise attracted the attention of a neighbor, who stepped outside to see what was happening. Seeing the neighbor, Daniel released Jennifer and fled. Jennifer, shaken and frightened, thanked the neighbor and hurried inside. She called Linda, hoping to find some way to resolve the situation without involving the police. Linda, hearing the fear in Jennifer's voice, agreed to meet with her the next day to discuss how to handle Daniel's increasingly unstable behavior. The next day, Linda met Jennifer at a local cafe. Jennifer, looking exhausted and tense, explained the encounter with Daniel and her growing fear for her safety. Linda listened intently, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a plan. She promised Jennifer that she would talk to Daniel and make him understand that their relationship was over. After the meeting, Linda returned home to find Daniel in a state of agitation. She confronted him about the incident with Jennifer, her voice a mix of anger and concern. Daniel, feeling cornered, lashed out at her, accusing her of taking Jennifer's side and betraying him. The argument escalated, and Linda, fearing for her own safety, retreated to their bedroom. That night Daniel's thoughts turned darker. He couldn't accept that Jennifer had rejected him, and that his own wife was against him. In his twisted mind, he believed that the only way to resolve the situation was to eliminate the source of his pain. He decided that if he couldn't have Jennifer, no one could. On a cold, clear night, Daniel made his way to the Johnsons' house. He knew Mark was out of town, leaving Jennifer alone. He broke in through a side window and made his way to the bedroom where Jennifer lay sleeping. The sight of her, peaceful and unaware, fueled his rage and desperation. He grabbed a kitchen knife and approached her, his mind filled with a chaotic mix of love and hatred. Jennifer awoke to the sight of Daniel standing over her, the knife gleaming in the dim light. She tried to scream, but Daniel covered her mouth, his grip strong and unyielding. In a fit of rage, he plunged the knife into her chest, silencing her cries. As Jennifer's life slipped away, Daniel stood over her, his mind a haze of conflicting emotions. In the aftermath of the murder, Daniel fled the scene, his hands stained with Jennifer's blood. He returned home where Linda found him trembling and incoherent. She realized immediately what he had done, and in a moment of twisted loyalty she decided to help him cover up the crime, the life they had built. The secrets they had kept were all at stake. Linda knew that if they were to survive, they needed to act quickly and decisively. Linda, driven by a twisted sense of loyalty and self-preservation, quickly took control of the situation. She led Daniel to the bathroom, instructing him to remove his clothes and wash off the blood. Her mind raced with the urgency of their predicament. She knew they had to act fast to cover up the crime and protect their secret life. As Daniel stood under the hot shower, the water turning pink around his feet, Linda gathered his clothes and placed them in a plastic bag. She scrubbed the floor where he had walked, making sure to eliminate any trace of blood. Once Daniel was cleaned up, she sat him down and forced him to recount every detail of what had happened. Despite his emotional state, Daniel managed to provide a coherent account, his voice shaking with the weight of his actions. Linda devised a plan. They needed to create an alibi and dispose of any evidence linking them to the crime. She called a trusted friend, claiming that Daniel had been with her all evening, ensuring their alibi was backed up. Then, she drove to a secluded area outside of town, where she burned Daniel's blood-stained clothes and the murder weapon, praying that the fire would consume any remaining evidence. The police questioned everyone in the neighborhood, including the Garners. Linda's carefully crafted alibi held up under scrutiny, and Daniel, although visibly distressed, managed to avoid raising suspicion. The investigation seemed to stall, with no concrete leads pointing to the Garners. Despite their initial success in evading the authorities, the psychological toll of the murder weighed heavily on both Daniel and Linda. Daniel became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the police were closing in on him. He withdrew from friends and colleagues, isolating himself in a web of fear and regret. Linda, while outwardly composed, felt the strain of their secret pressing down on her. She became hypervigilant, scrutinizing every interaction and behavior for signs of suspicion from those around them. The weeks following Jennifer's murder were a blur of tension and deception for the Garners. Linda took on the role of the stabilizer, managing Daniel's paranoia while ensuring their public facade remained intact. She monitored the news for any updates on the investigation, relieved that the police seemed to have no solid leads. However, Linda knew that maintaining their cover required more than just an alibi. They needed to create a narrative that would divert attention away from Daniel. She suggested to Daniel that he should appear more distraught over Jennifer's death, to align with the community's grief, and to throw off any suspicion. At social gatherings and community meetings, Daniel played the part of the grieving friend. He spoke of Jennifer with a mix of fondness and sorrow, his eyes often welling up with tears. Mark, devastated and desperate for answers, seemed to appreciate Daniel's empathy, never suspecting his friend's involvement in his wife's death. Daniel's mental state deteriorated further, his guilt manifesting in nightmares and hallucinations. He started drinking heavily, seeking solace in alcohol but finding only temporary escape. Linda, fearing he might confess in a drunken stupor, kept a close eye on him, often staying up late to ensure he didn't leave the house. One evening, as Daniel sat slumped over a glass of whiskey, he broke down. He confessed to Linda that he couldn't live with the guilt any longer, that he needed to come clean. Linda, panicked, tried to calm him down. To help maintain their composure, Linda suggested they take a short trip out of town. They traveled to a secluded cabin in the mountains, hoping the change of scenery would help Daniel regain some semblance of peace. The isolation provided a temporary respite, allowing them to plan their next steps without the constant pressure of the investigation looming over them. During their time at the cabin, Linda reinforced the importance of their secrecy. She coached Daniel on how to handle police questioning and public interactions, drilling him until he could respond without hesitation. Linda's determination to protect their lifestyle and avoid imprisonment fueled her relentless drive to keep their story straight. Upon returning to Pine Hill, the Garners resumed their lives with a renewed sense of purpose. Daniel, though still haunted by his actions, managed to present a more stable front. Linda continued to manage their interactions with the community, ensuring they remained above suspicion. However, the cracks in their facade were beginning to show. Friends and neighbors noticed Daniel's increased drinking and erratic behavior, and whispers of his possible involvement in Jennifer's death began to circulate. Linda, ever vigilant, worked to quash the rumors, but she knew their time was running out. As the police investigation continued, new evidence came to light, pointing towards inconsistencies in Daniel's alibi. The Garners' carefully constructed world was on the brink of collapse, and the truth was closer to being revealed ever before. Detective Mitchell interviewed the Garners separately, noting any discrepancies in their stories. Linda's carefully crafted alibi held up under scrutiny, and Daniel's emotional state seemed consistent with that of a grieving friend. However, Mitchell's instincts told her there was more to the story. As the weeks passed, new evidence emerged. Forensic analysis of Jennifer's phone records revealed a series of increasingly desperate text messages from Daniel, indicating his obsession with her. Mitchell brought Daniel in for further questioning, pressing him on the inconsistencies in his alibi and the nature of his relationship with Jennifer. Daniel, struggling to maintain his composure, stuck to the story Linda had coached him on. But his nervousness and evasive answers only heightened the detective's suspicions. The turning point came when a neighbor came forward with crucial information. They had seen Daniel's car parked near the Johnsons' house on the night of the murder, and remembered the strange behavior he had exhibited. This testimony, combined with the forensic evidence and Daniel's erratic behavior, was enough for the police to obtain a search warrant for the Garners' home. During the search, the police found remnants of the burned clothing and traces of blood that had seeped into the floorboards, despite Linda's thorough cleaning. This damning evidence, coupled with the witness testimony and phone records, painted a clear picture of Daniel's guilt. The net was closing in on the Garners, and Linda realized that their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. She knew that their only chance of escaping a lengthy prison sentence was to come up with a new plan, one that would shift the blame away from them and onto someone else. As the police closed in, Linda and Daniel faced the harsh reality of their situation. The lies and deceit that had once protected them were now threatening to unravel completely. And the truth was about to be revealed in a way they could never have anticipated. As the evidence against Daniel mounted, Detective Mitchell prepared to make her move. She brought Daniel in for another round of questioning, this time with a different approach. She laid out all the evidence they had gathered, the phone records, the witness testimonies, and the forensic findings. Daniel, cornered and overwhelmed, began to crack under the pressure. Mitchell pressed harder, suggesting that if Daniel came clean, he might receive a more lenient sentence. Daniel, unable to handle the weight of his guilt and the relentless questioning, finally broke down. He confessed to killing Jennifer, describing his obsession, the confrontation, and the moment he lost control. However, in his confession, Daniel also implicated Linda, revealing her role in covering up the crime. He described how she had helped him clean up, dispose of evidence, and craft an alibi. Mitchell, sensing the opportunity to get the full story, had Linda brought in for questioning as well. Confronted with Daniel's confession, Linda initially denied any involvement. But as Mitchell detailed the evidence in Daniel's account, Linda realized there was no way out. Her carefully constructed lies had finally unraveled. She admitted to helping Daniel, explaining that she had done it out of a misguided sense of loyalty and fear of losing everything they had built. The trial of Daniel and Linda Garner captivated Pine Hill and the surrounding region. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers, eager to see the conclusion of the tragic tale. Daniel, charged with first-degree murder, and Linda, charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice, both pled guilty to their respective charges. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Linda, despite her role in the cover-up, received a lighter sentence due to her cooperation with the investigation, and her previously clean record. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10. Mark Johnson, left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, found some solace in the justice served but continued to mourn the loss of his beloved wife.